Hi, good morning, class. We are on to day 4 of our novel studies. So today we're going to be reading chapters 7 and 8 of Because of Winn, Dixie, and I'm so excited. So today our objective is Kipsters will be able to identify a character trait using their thoughts, words, and actions. So the first thing we need to make sure we know what is a character trait. Character traits are words that describe the character's personality. So not how the character's feeling, but what the character's personality is like. So maybe it's that they're funny, maybe it's that they're shy or outgoing or silly or hardworking. All of those different are different personality traits. And we can find those by looking at what the characters say, what the characters think, and what the characters do. We've talked about this already this year, so I know we're going to do so awesome at it today. So we're going to use 3 steps to make sure we're identifying those character traits. So first, we're going to think about what are the character's thoughts, words, and actions in that paragraph or in that chapter. Then we're going to ask ourselves, what does the character's thoughts, words, and actions tell me about that character's personality? What word is what I use to describe them based off of those things? And then finally, step 3, we're always going to find our evidence to prove our answer. So let's get started with chapter 7 for today. I'm going to read it out loud. At the end of chapter 7, we're going to go through a character traits question together. So if we remember from yesterday and the day before, Opal just went to the library and made a new friend with Miss Franny Block. Franny helped Opal by letting Winn Dixie come into the store and by becoming one of her friends and talking to her. So Franny is now one of Opal's first friends in the city. So we're going to see what other friends she makes throughout the story, what other friendships she and Winn Dixie create throughout their town. Today we're going to be learning about Miss Franny Block again a little bit. So keep listening and we're going to see what we can learn about her character. Chapter 7. You guys can open, I'm so sorry. You can open chapter 7 and 8 document to follow along with me as I'm reading out loud. If you need to pause this for a second to pull it up, feel free to do that. Chapter 7. Back when Florida was wild, when it consisted of nothing but palmetto trees and mosquitoes, so big they could fly away with you, Miss Franny Block started in. And I was just a little girl, no bigger than you. My father, Herman W. Block, told me that I could have anything I wanted for my birthday. Anything at all. Miss Franny looked around the library. She leaned in closer to me. I don't want to appear prideful, she said, but my daddy was a very rich man. A very rich man. She nodded, and Len leaned back and said, and I was a little girl who loved to read. So I told him, I said, Daddy, I would most certainly love to have a library for my birthday. A small little library would be wonderful. You asked for a whole library? A small one, Miss Franny nodded. I wanted a little house full of nothing but books, and I wanted to share them too. And I got my wish. My father built me this house, the very one we are sitting in now. And at a very young age, I became a librarian. Yes, ma'am. What about the bear? I said. Did I mention that Florida was wild in those days? Miss Franny Block said. Uh-huh, you did. It was wild. There were wild men and wild women and wild animals. Like bears? Yes, ma'am. That's right. Now, I have to tell you, I was a little Miss Know-It-All. I was a Miss Smarty Pants, with my library full of books. Oh, yes, ma'am, I thought I knew the answers to everything. Well, one hot Thursday, I was sitting in my library with all the doors and windows open and my nose stuck in a book, when a shadow crossed the desk. And without looking up, yes, ma'am, without even looking up, I said, is there a book I can help you find? Well, there was no answer. And I thought it might have been a wild man or a wild woman, scared of all these books and afraid to speak up. But then I became aware of a very peculiar smell, a very strong smell. I raised my eyes slowly, and standing right in front of me was a bear. Yes, ma'am, a very large bear. How big? I asked. Oh, well, said Miss Franny, perhaps 3 times the size of your dog. Then what happened? I asked her. Well, said Miss Franny, I looked at him, and he looked at me. He put his big nose up in the air and sniffed as if he were trying to decide if a little Miss Know-it-all librarian was what he was in the mood to eat. And I sat there. And then I thought, well, if this bear intends to eat me, I am not going to let it happen without a fight. No, ma'am. So very slowly and very carefully, I raised up the book I was reading. What book was that? I asked. Why, it was War and Peace, a very large book. I raised it up slowly, and then I aimed it carefully, and I threw it right at the bear and screamed, Be gone! And you know what? No, ma'am, I said. He went. But this is what I will never forget. He took the book with him. Nuh-uh, I said. Yes, ma'am, said Miss Franny. He snatched it up and ran. Did he come back? I asked. No, I never saw him again. Well, the men in the town used to tease me about it. They used to say, Miss Franny, we saw that bear of yours out in the woods today. He was reading that book, and he said it sure was good, and would it be all right if he kept it for just another week? Yes, ma'am, they did tease me about it, she sighed. I imagine I'm the only one left from those days. I imagine I'm the only one that even recalls that bear. All my friends, everyone I knew when I was young, they are all dead and gone. She sighed again. She looked sad and old and wrinkled. It was the very same way I felt sometimes, being friendless in a new town and not having a mamma to comfort me. I sighed too. When Dixie raised her head off his paws and looked back and forth between me and Miss Franny, he sat up and then showed Miss Franny his teeth. Well now, look at that, she said. That dog is smiling at me. It's a talent of his, I told her. It is a fine talent, Miss Franny said. A very fine talent. And she smiled back at Winn-Dixie. We could be friends, I said to Miss Franny. I mean, you and me and Winn-Dixie, we could all be friends. Miss Franny smiled even bigger. Why, that would be grand, she said. Just grand. And right at that minute, right when the 3 of us had decided to be friends, who should come marching into Herman W. Block Memorial Library but an old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. She walked right up to Miss Franny's desk and said, I finished Johnny Tremaine, and I enjoyed it very much. I would like something even more difficult to read, because I am an advanced reader. Yes, dear, I know, said Miss Franny. She got up out of her chair. Amanda pretended like I wasn't there. She stared right past me. Are dogs allowed in the library? She asked Miss Franny as they walked away. Certain ones, said Miss Franny, a select few. Then she turned around and winked at me. I smiled back. I had just made my first friend in Naomi, and nobody was going to mess that up for me. Not even old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. All right, class, we're going to pause there and move on to our objective for today. Identify a character trait using a character's thoughts, words, and actions. So I want us to think about our character today that we're answering our question about. So our question that we're learning or that we're answering today is based on her thoughts, words, and actions. What character trait would you use to describe Miss Franny Block? There are 3 choices. Would we say A, rude, B, quiet, or C, unusual? So I'm going to think through these steps. First, I'm going to think about her thoughts, words, and actions in the story. And one thing I noticed was Miss Franny did a lot of talking in the story, so that's a lot of words. So that's what I'm going to think about as I'm going through the story. And her actions. So in chapter 7, she talked a lot about a story when a bear came to her library and the bear took her book with her and came into the library. So those are her words. She's explaining that in the story. And to me, that's not rude to explain that story, and that's not quiet, but that is a little unusual. Unusual means, a little weird or a little bit different. And so far, that's kind of what I'm thinking about Miss Franny Block. I also remember from the last chapter, Miss Franny Block talked about how she spent a lot of her days just in this library, and in the beginning of this chapter, she talked about that too, all by herself, with no one else around. So that also is a little bit unusual to spend your day just, all cooped up by yourself. So I'm going to choose the word unusual. Now, for my answer, I want to make sure I have evidence to support it. So I wrote here, Miss Franny Block is unusual. I know Miss Franny Block is unusual based on her words and her actions. In the beginning of the story, her actions showed that she was a little unusual or interesting because she thought Winn Dixie was a bear. So that was back in the last chapter. She thought Winn Dixie was a bear. And that's a little unusual because dogs don't really look like bears. Later in the story, her words show me that she's unusual because she tells a story about how a bear came into her library and took one of her books. These two instances show me that Miss Franny Block is an unusual or a strange character. So, I used Miss Franny Block's actions, what she did when she thought that, when she yelled and screamed about Winn Dixie being a dog. And then the second thing I looked at were her words when she was explaining the story about how the bear came in and took one of her books and came into a library, which is just kind of unusual that could happen. So for the next chapter, we're going to be reading chapter 8, and we're going to be looking for a new character that we're learning about called Otis. And we're going to look for what character trait could we use to describe Otis based on this chapter. So you can go and pull up chapter 8. We're learning about all new different characters in this story. Almost every chapter has a new character and some new friendships that Winn Dixie and Opal are making. All right, chapter 8. Winn Dixie's bald spots started growing fur, and the fur that he had to begin with started looking shiny and healthy, and he didn't limp anymore. And you could tell that he was proud of looking so good, proud of not looking like a stray. I thought what he needed most was a collar and a leash, so I went into Gertrude's Pets, where there were fish and snakes and mice and lizards and gerbils and pet supplies, and I found a real handsome red leather collar and matching leash. Winn Dixie was not allowed to come inside the store. There was a big sign on the door that said, "No dogs allowed." So I held the collar and the leash up to the window, and Winn Dixie, who was standing on the other side of the window, pulled up his lip and showed me his teeth and sneezed and wagged his tail, something furious. So I knew he was absolutely loved that leash and collar combination. But it was very expensive. I decided to explain my situation to the man behind the counter. I said, "I don't get a big enough allowance to afford something this fancy. But I love this collar and leash, and so does my dog. And I was thinking that maybe you could set me up on an installment plan." "An installment plan?" said the man. "Gertrude!" somebody screamed in a real irritating voice. I looked around. It was a parrot. She was sitting on top of one of the fish tanks, looking right at me. "An installment plan," I said, ignoring the parrot. "And where I promise to give you my allowance every week, and you give me the leash and the collar now." "I don't think I can do that," said the man. He shook his head. "No, the owner wouldn't like that." He looked down at the counter. He wouldn't look at me. He had thick black hair, and it was slicked back like Elvis Presley's. He had on a name tag that said Otis. "Or I could work for you," I said. "I could come in and sweep the floors and dust the shelves and take out the trash. I could do that." I looked around Gertrude's Pets. There was sand and sunflower seed shells and big dust bunnies all over the floor. I could tell that it was needed to be swept. Said Otis. He looked down at the counter some more. Gertrude, said the parrot. The parrot screamed again. I'm really trustworthy, I said. I'm new in town, but my daddy is a preacher. He's the preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. So I'm real honest. But the only thing is, when Dixie, my dog, he would have to come inside with me. Because if we get separated for too long, he starts to howl, something terrible. Gertrude doesn't like dogs, said Otis. Is she the owner? I asked. Yes, no, he finally looked up. He pointed at the fish tank. That, Gertrude, the parrot, I named her after the owner. Gertrude's a pretty parrot, screamed Gertrude. She might like Winn Dixie, I told Otis. Almost everybody does. Maybe he could come inside and meet her, and if the two of them get along, then could I have the job? Maybe, Otis mumbled. He looked down at the counter again. So I went and opened the doors, and Winn Dixie came trotting on inside the store. Dog, screamed Gertrude. I know it, Otis told her. And then Gertrude got real quiet. She sat on top of the fish tank and cocked her head from one side to the other, looking at Winn Dixie. And Winn Dixie stood and stared back at her. He didn't hardly move. He didn't wag his tail, he didn't smile, he didn't sneeze. He just stared at Gertrude and she stared at him. And then she spread her wings out real far and flew and landed on top of Winn Dixie's head. Dog, she croaked. Winn Dixie wagged his tail just a little tiny bit, and Otis said, You can start on Monday. Thank you, I told him. You won't be sorry. On the way out of Gertrude's Pets, I said to Winn Dixie, You are better at making friends than anybody I have ever known. I bet if Mama knew you, she would think that you were the best dog ever. Winn Dixie was smiling up at me, and I was smiling down at him, and so neither one of us was looking where we were going, and we almost bumped right into Sweetie Pie Thomas. She was standing there, sucking on the knuckle of her third finger, staring in the window of Gertrude's Pets. She took her finger out of her mouth and looked at me. Her eyes were big and round. Was that bird sitting on the dog's head? She asked. She had her hair tied up in a ponytail with a pink ribbon. But it wasn't much of a ponytail. It was really mostly ribbon and a few strands of hair. Yes, I told her. I seen it, she said. She nodded her head and put her knuckle back in her mouth. Then she took it out again real quick. I seen that dog in church, too. He was catching a mouse. I want a dog just like it, but my mama won't let me get no dog. She says if I'm real good, I may get to buy me a goldfish or one of them gerbils. That's what she says. Can I pet your dog? Sure, I told her. Sweetie Pie stroked Winn Dixie's head so long and serious that his eyes drooped, half closed, and drool came out the other side of his mouth. I'm going to be 6 years old in September. I gotta stop sucking on my knuckle once I'm 6, said Sweetie Pie. I'm having a party. Do you want to come to my party? The theme is pink. Sure, I told her. Can this dog come? She asked. You bet, I told her. And all of a sudden, I felt happy. I had a dog, I had a job, I had Miss Franny Block for a friend, and I had my first invitation to a party in Naomi. It didn't matter that it came from a 5-year-old and that the party wasn't until September. I didn't feel so lonely anymore. All right, that is the end of chapter 8. So now, Winn Dixie and Opal are making all sorts of friends. So I want you to think in your head right now, think about all of the different characters that Winn Dixie and Opal have become friends with. So I can think of Miss Franny Block. They just kind of made friends with Otis, so we'll see where that one goes. And now Sweetie Pie. So throughout the story, they've just been continually making new friends and forming different friendships. So we're just going to see where this goes next. For your question today, the character you're thinking about is Otis. So you want to be thinking, the question says, and you can look on the document for day 134 questions. So, 1 minute, my computer just got a little bit off. So the question that you have for your independent practice today is, based on his thoughts, words, and actions, what character trait would you use to describe Otis? You can look at pages 54 through 56. You're looking for, is he funny, is he shy, or is he smart? So I want you to choose one of those answers and then find your evidence to support it. Remember, you're looking for what is he thinking, what did he say, or what did he do to choose your answer. So fill those blanks in. I will be checking them and giving you feedback this evening. And tomorrow we will be reading. It's Friday, so we have 2 more chapters for this week. Tomorrow we'll be reading chapters 9 and 10. Have a great day. Bye.